Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to offer Dana, then please do go to justthiszen.org/giving. Your support really does make a huge difference. Thank you so much.
This week's topic is called Life as It Is. And I've been thinking about what have I learned as a result of this focus on Zazen whilst preparing these classes. So in the first session, we talked about Flint's instruction, how simple can you let it be? And after all of this exploration, that's what I've returned to with a deeper sense of it. And the preparation I've done for these sessions has also made me understand life as it is in a different way. I've really spotted how inbuilt the urge to do something is, to manipulate our experience in some way. So in the first session as well, I said a little bit about what I think I do or don't do in Zazen. And this deeper dive into the teachings on Zazen has helped me recognise more clearly the habits I've developed after many years of sitting practice. I now recognise a complacency had set in. I'd lost beginner's mind, and I'd adopted either strategies or no strategy. Sometimes I would, and still do, sit and allow myself to drift, not to be alert, and to get lost in a thought process for long periods of time. On the other hand, I'd sometimes adopt techniques such as focusing on the breath or sounds or visualizations. Visualizations as a way to place myself in the universe, sort of gradually expanding my awareness from the room I sit in and the people I'm sitting with out to my local area and Sheffield, England, etc., until I included the entire universe. And at other times I might do the loving kindness practice. So these are all things that I would sometimes refer back to, meditation techniques that sometimes I would continue to use in Zazen. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. However, the key thing for me is that all of those, I suppose maybe not including zoning out, but zoning out is not the same as Zazen, but all of those things that I've described are techniques, are ways to try and manipulate our experience in some way rather than to just be with it. They're doing, their activity. And this is another good reason why we practice Zazen, why we practice just noticing, because the ways that we manipulate our experience in Zazen and in life can be very subtle and hard to catch because it's so inbuilt. It's so inbuilt. We're programmed to move towards comfort and away from discomfort. And we have so many ways of doing this in our day-to-day lives as well as in Zazen. We try to suppress unwelcome feelings in many ways in our everyday lives, maybe with food, painkillers, alcohol, fantasies, compulsive exercise, overworking, social media, worrying, trying to control, to move towards comfort and away from discomfort, anything rather than be with life as it is. With our reactivity, it's not fair. Judgments, they shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have done that. Our complaints about the weather, isn't it an awful day? I want to keep emphasising that I'm not talking about right or wrong. It's not a moral thing, but it's about more freedom from our suffering. And that's why I love Zen, because once we begin to loosen our ideas about good and bad, we can be kinder to ourselves, and then we can really look closely at what we do and hopefully it's less painful when there's less self-judgment. So in our day-to-day lives, we're constantly trying to manipulate our experience, as I said. And if we practice non-doing in Zazen, it may help us to allow more of our experiences in life, rather than try to avoid or manipulate them so often, which at an extreme can take the form of addiction, but can also, at a less extreme, negatively affect our relationships, our health, our emotional well-being. A few years ago, you know how sometimes we hear or read something that really stays with us, and a few years ago I came across some teaching that pointed out how strongly the mind wants to cling on to the idea of a solid identity. And then I began to notice how many of the thoughts that arose in Zazen, my thoughts that arose in Zazen, were designed to maintain this solid sense of who I think I am. Intellectually, we might understand that we're not solid, unchanging, separate selves that need to defend ourselves, and yet this is what we do much of the time. Zazen gives us an opportunity to rest into a larger space and to practice that in the Zendo so that we can practice it in everyday life. Catherine Thanis says, we start by watching thoughts and feelings, and in extended sittings, we sometimes have the opportunity to experience the space in which these thoughts and feelings arise. We might find ourselves stepping back from the contents of the mind to the space in which the contents are arising. We ask, who is thinking? Gradually we enter the space in which the contents of the mind play. Immediately we have a different perspective on this thing we call I. What is I? What is this? The point of practice is to ask this question. We are so much more than our identification with our story, with a certain part of our mind that keeps repeating itself. So when we think we're this solid self, we feel a need to defend that self. I'm not talking about healthy boundaries and personal safety, they're essential. I'm talking about those times where I become unnecessarily defensive because I think I've been misunderstood, or I'm not being seen the way I want to be seen. This is me trying to maintain an idea about myself that I'm attached to, trying to make the other person see me that way. As I've become more aware of this, I'm practicing dropping the idea that I need to be seen a certain way. And when I can see the futility of my defensiveness, letting it go feels like such a relief. It's another way of surrendering to life as it is, rather than trying to bend life to our own will. As Flint says, you can fight reality, but reality will always win. So, one of the reasons why posture is so important in Zazen is because the stillness embodies or represents an intention to practice steadiness and non-reactivity. How often, when we're not sitting in Zazen, are we fidgeting and trying to get away from our physical pain or discomfort? And many of our physical issues come from moving in ways that we unconsciously think will take less effort or discomfort, and therefore we bypass certain movements that are necessary to keep our body flexible, aligned and healthy. And again, that, translates to the psyche as well. And this is yet another example of what Zazen can teach us by requesting that we set an intention to sit still, to not be constantly adjusting physically and emotionally. And again, I'm not talking about an endurance test and sitting in extreme pain. A lot of Zen teachers refer to different techniques from other forms of meditation, using objects such as the breath or a mantra as a kind of tool on the way towards Zazen itself. Zazen itself, as we've discovered, can be described as an open awareness, or to repeat the metaphor, that I borrowed from Flint, an awareness that resembles a floodlight rather than the spotlight of object-focused meditation techniques. And Domio Burke, who I quoted last week, and she's a new discovery of mine, and she's on Spotify. I think she's brilliant. I didn't discover her actually. I think Nicola did and recommended it to Jan, and then Jan recommended it to me. So she recommends not falling back into using techniques from other types of meditation. She says, Zazen involves a complete surrender to being present with whatever is happening without trying to control it. If you always have an alternative in the back of your mind, a form of meditation you can try if you don't like what's happening in Zazen, then your surrender can't be so complete. And that's really affected me, that thought and that instruction. It's impacted on my Zazen practice. And what I've realised is that non-doing is very elusive, and the ways we try to manipulate our experience can be very subtle. On a psychological level, we know that avoiding our feelings to an extreme extent can lead to great suffering. This is evident in people with addiction serious enough to make their lives and their relationships intolerable. On a spiritual level, we're practicing so we can fulfill our vow to turn towards the suffering of ourselves, other people, and the whole world. And so sitting in surrender, as Domio Burke describes it, is an antidote to this constant manipulation of our experience. Very often, even after this deep dive that I've been doing into Zazen, when I catch myself lost in thought, as I return to present moment experience, I notice that a question pops up straight away. What am I supposed to be doing? And I'm beginning to let go, to surrender, to really practice letting it be simple. Tim Burkitt says, the idea of effortless effort may be confusing at first. Our effort may be toward a very specific cultivation that is involved in Zazen. When we feel our mind drifting, we know we've wandered off the cushion away from Zazen. Our effort is to remain in that gentle awareness of whatever comes up. Our effort is to open into the feeling of unbounded space and then allow it to expand. Behind the idea of effortless effort is the necessity of undoing our mind's patterned activity. When patterned activity stops, we sit in a space of emptiness. If we can stay with the subtle energy of effortless effort, a settling in happens. We get a taste of boundlessness. There's nothing more to do or to know. Just sitting still and doing nothing is it. I love the reference there to a taste of boundlessness. A taste is embodied rather than something the mind does. And yet, my pesky mind immediately wants to grasp at that taste of boundlessness. So then we have to remember the without desire part, effort without desire. So I'm playing with those two phrases, effortless effort without desire. Just sitting still and doing nothing is it. Dogen famously said, to study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be intimate with all life. I've heard versions of this quote many times over the years and always liked the acknowledgement that we're required to study ourselves first and foremost. But I realise that that's really only because this is the route towards understanding the universality of our habits, of the way we suffer, the universal in our particular experience. But as we begin to see through our own conditioning, our personal concerns become less interesting to us. In fact, in practice discussion with Flint on retreat after a few years of practice, I was trying to explain to him how I'm boring myself. I was sick of my mind constantly checking in on my state. And he said it can be a bit of a curse of being a psychologically minded person, such as a therapist, because analysing your state and other people's and the reason behind that can become a habit. And I've spent most of my adult life monitoring my state. And of course, it's important when you're in the therapist chair, you need to know what's your stuff and what's not. So we know that self-inquiry and self-knowledge are valuable, but I had begun to really bore myself with this habit of my mind, because constant monitoring of one's state can easily lead to habits of trying to manipulate that state when we don't like what we're feeling. And I've found that practice has definitely helped me to drop this analytical mind habit somewhat, or at least be with a feeling rather than jumping straight to analysis of why I'm feeling that way. And I guess this is practicing not knowing or don't know mind. We are where we are because of all the causes and conditions of everything that's ever happened, and we can't possibly know what they all are. Norman Fisher says, Zazen is fundamentally sitting with the basic feeling of being alive. What is the basic feeling of being alive? Being conscious, embodied, and breathing. That is actually what it feels like to be alive. Every moment of your life and all of your feelings, thoughts, and accomplishments depend on this. But most of us hardly ever notice it. In Zazen, our task is to just be present with this and nothing else, simply sitting aware of the feeling of being alive. Finally, I did say last week that I would say something about setting an intention for Zazen, and how does this fit in with non-doing. Here's Domio Burke again. Of course, there are subtle practices we can do to encourage ourselves to be more wholehearted in Zazen. Practices we can try to use very, very gently so they don't become doing. They don't become trying to control our meditative experience or achieve a particular outcome. So you might set your intention at the beginning. For the next 30 minutes, I want to, and insert whatever works for you here. Say, I want to just sit, or I want to sit Zazen, or my version is, for the next 30 minutes, I want to set aside all activity in order to align with what is most important. Then when I awaken from a dream of thought in which I'm planning a project or something, I shine the light of awareness on what's happening. And my intention is also present, made stronger, my awareness, because of my explicit formulation of it 10 or 20 minutes earlier. So I thought that was quite useful, a useful way to begin our Zazen if we don't already do that. My final quote is from our very own Maria, and I can tell you that it comes from hard-won experience. She says, suffering is to reject reality. Meeting life as it is what I need to do every day, whilst noticing those other parts of me that just don't like it. And there's lots of joy in me too. It's always there, ready to meet whenever I let go and surrender to the here and now. Thank you, Maria, and thanks everyone.